Why self-expression often means the loss of the self. Most people today are encouraged to do the same thing. Express yourself, be authentic, say what you feel, be yourself. These are the mantras of today. But here is the uncomfortable question that no one asks. What if there is no self to express? Because in classical philosophy, expression was never the beginning. Formation was the beginning. And when expression comes before formation, it does not reveal the self. It actually dissolves it. And this is not an attack on self-expression. It is a diagnosis. Because a culture that is obsessed with expression is producing individuals who feel fragmented, unstable, emotionally fragile, and strangely absent from their own lives. And this question is not psychological, it is philosophical, because long before modern culture told us to be ourselves, classical philosophy asked a very different question. How is the self formed at all? And here, the ancient view becomes quite unsettling, because in ancient thought, the self was not something you automatically possessed, it was something you became. For Plato, the soul, it is not a fixed identity, it's a living structure in motion. It is a dynamic tension between different forces, between desire, between emotion, between thoughts, between reason. If these forces are not ordered, there is no unified self. Only internal drives that are competing for expression. And here is where the Greek language becomes extremely precise, because the word character, which is Χαρακτήρ, comes from the verb harasso, which means to engrave something, to carve slowly into stone or wood. It's the way a sculptor cuts into marble to bring form out of resistance. So, character in this sense is not something you declare or simply express. It is something that is etched into you. And this happens painfully, and happens painfully and gradually through repetition, through endurance and resistance. Just as the statue does not emerge from a single strike, but from countless deliberate cuts, character is formed through time, but what you repeatedly choose to restrain and what you repeatedly choose to endure, and what you repeatedly choose to shape. This is why Aristotle says that character is not mood and not impulse. It is what remains after all the impulses have been worked upon. And from this perspective, the central question is not how do I express myself, but what is being carved into me over time. And only then we can ask the question, is this something worthy of expression? What must I become in order for my expression to have truth? And this is not a theoretical idea. In ancient Greece, even a person's name was not always fixed for life. Many of the names that we know today, and we consider them classical Greek names, became known not by their names that they were born with, but by the names they reflected what they have become. Plato, for example, was not born Plato. Plato was given the name Aristocles. The name Plato came later, and it means broad, and it was a recognition of form, because he was a big guy, so it was his physical presence, his manner of speech, and the depth of his intellect. Democritus was known as the laughing philosopher, and this was not mockery, it was a sign of how he perceived human foolishness against the immensity of the cosmos. And Theophrastus, who was Aristotle's successor, was originally named Tyrtamus. Aristotle gave him the name Theophrastus, which means divinely spoken, to honor his clarity and the grace of his speech. A name could change, and it could change because a person had taken a different shape, and this tells us something essential. In a culture where the self is formed, expression follows structure, it does not precede it. This is why self-expression so often feels relieving at first today, but empty soon after. Let's slow down a bit here and examine the word itself. The word expression comes from the Latin expremere, and it means to press out, to force outward under pressure. So expression presupposes that something inside has already been shaped, integrated, and made ready to appear in the world. But here comes the modern problem. When there is no inner structure, what gets expressed is not essence, it is pressure, it is unexamined emotion, it is unintegrated desire, it's borrowed identities, it's ideologies, it is inner contradictions. And expression without formation, it will never be revelation like this. It is a leakage, it is a discharge, it is draining the self. When everything speaks, nothing leads. Think about this carefully. If every impulse is allowed to come out, to speak, to be heard, who is doing the listening and who is doing the speaking? If today one desire speaks and tomorrow it's opposite, depending on our mood, and the next day a borrowed narrative from our environment comes out, what exactly is the self here? A self that includes everything cannot act as one, and this is why constant self-expression so often leads to not to clarity, but to exhaustion. People feel exposed, but they are totally unknown to their own selves. And they are expressive, but they are not integrated. We can see this pattern clearly in modern public figures who were encouraged to be themselves without ever being taught how to become themselves. And a striking example of this is Jim Carrey. And this is important to say clearly here that this is not an attack on Jim Carrey. I absolutely love Jim Carrey, but on the contrary, it is an expression of respect to the guy because Carrey was celebrated precisely for his unlimited expressiveness. His face, his voice, his body, everything moved freely, elastically, without restraint. He was a phenomenon. And for years, this was understood as authenticity. But later, Carrey himself began to describe a very different inner experience. He spoke openly about depression, about the collapse of identity, about the realization that Jim Carrey was not the self, but a mask that was constantly performed. And at one point, he said plainly that there is no one here anymore to express anything. And this is not a failure of talent. It is not psychological weakness. It is not some kind of personal pathology. It is the logical consequence of expression without a center. And Jim Carrey saw it, recognized it, and acted upon it. And this thing is not an exception. It is what happens when expression has no center, and it is a pattern, and it reveals something structural. In philosophical terms, what Carrey went through resembles a Dionysian passage. It is a dissolution of form. It is a tearing apart of the masks. It is a confrontation with the absence of a stable self. And this is something we will explore deeply in the episode on Dionysus, in the series of the gods. But here is the crucial difference. In the ancient world, such passages were prepared for, they were guided, they were contained and integrated within a larger structure of formation. In our time, most people encounter these experiences only after the collapse and only through suffering, if they encounter them at all. Many people live their lives inside confusion and leave this world more fragmented than when they entered it. And this is not accidental. It has everything to do with how modern institutions are structured, our educational systems, our social norms, our public discourse, even psychology. In the ancient city-states, Paideia, which was the education, existed precisely to prevent this fate. Education was not about information, it was about formation. The institutions were shaped by philosophers, not by experts, not by technocrats, not by systems organized for efficiency. They were designed to form a human being capable of enduring truth before being shattered by it. When everything speaks, nothing leads. And where nothing leads, the self does not evolve, it slowly disappears. Why? This feels like freedom. This fragmentation in the beginning feels like freedom. There is no restraint, there is no hierarchy, there is no inner authority. But classical philosophy defines freedom differently. Freedom is not the absence of limits. Freedom is inner sovereignty. Aristotle's concept of 앵γκράτεια, which is self-mastery, it is not repression or suppression, it is form. It is the capacity to hold oneself together long enough to act deliberately rather than reactively. Without inner form, expression becomes noise. And noise can feel liberating until it leaves nothing standing. The Pythagorean correction. Form before expression. This understanding appears with incredible clarity in the Pythagorean tradition. The golden verses do not offer moral preaching, they offer a technical instruction for the soul. There is one teaching that says, I will say this in Greek first, and then I will give you the translation in English. Βουλεύου δε προ έργου, όπως μη μωρά πέλητε. Δηλού τη πράσιν τελέγειν τα ανόητα προς ανδρός, αλλά τάδε εκτελέειν. Άσε μη μετέπειτα ανίηση, πράσε δε μηδεν ον μη επίστασε, αλλά διδάσκευ όσα χρεών και τερπνότα των βίων όδε διάξεις. So the translation is, be deliberate before acting, so that nothing foolish may come to be. For it is unworthy of a human being to do and to say senseless things, but accomplish those things which will not later cause you any regret. Do nothing of what you do not truly know and learn what is necessary. And thus you will live a most pleasant life. Now, observe the structure here. The word βουλεύου does not mean think casually, it means to be deliberate, to take counsel. It is the same family of words that give the modern Greek for parliament, which is vouli, the council. And this is also the ancient voulefteria, where the free citizens were gathering to vote, take decisions upon their future, the places of deliberation, where they met to decide their actions. Here, the council is internal. So before action, before speech, before feeling, before expressing anything, the soul must first gather itself. And then it comes the other word that is used, which is mora. Moro doesn't mean stupid. It means unformed, without measure, and it belongs to the same field of words from which the modern word baby comes from. Moro is baby in Greek. And this is, of course, not an insult to babies. It is describing a state of undeveloped will. It is a state where emotion and desire dominate before inner order exists. And the instruction here is very precise. Do not act, do not speak, do not express from what has not yet been shaped. Learn first, form first, then act without regret. And this hides a silent state of being. And this is the complete inversion of modern self-expression culture. What formation actually means, morphosis. Formation has nothing to do with moralism. It is not about suppression. It is not obedience to social norms. In Greek, there is a very precise word for the achievement of this state, this inner state, and it is morphosis. And the one who has achieved it is called morphomenos. And this does not mean educated in the modern informational sense. It means someone who has taken form, who has developed his shape. So the word comes from morphe, which is shape, structure, intelligible form. A morphomeno human being is not someone who expresses everything, but someone whose inner forces have been shaped into a coherent order. And this is why formation means self-observation. Learn to observe yourself before expressing something. Learn to endure silence before speaking. Learn to distinguish what arises within you from what truly governs you. And it means recognizing that not everything inside you deserves a microphone. Some things require attention, some things require time, some things require transformation before they can truthfully appear in speech or action. And here the Greek language becomes very exact, because the opposite of morphe is not freedom or something, it is aschimia. The word aschimos is formed by alpha, a negation, and schema. Schema, shape. And it does not mean morally bad. It means without shape, without proportion, without intelligible form. What is aschimon, ugly, is not evil. It is unformed. And this gives depth to a very famous inscription that it was said to stand at the entrance of Plato's academy. Medeis, Ageometretos, Ἰσίτο. Let no one untrained in geometry enter. This was not elitism. It was not about mathematics as a subject and geometry. Geometria meant the training of the mind to understand form, proportion, and limit. In other words, if you cannot recognize form, you cannot recognize truth, and if you cannot recognize measure, you cannot carry freedom. And this is why the Greeks did not worship spontaneity, they respected metron, measure. So let me leave you with one final question. If everything inside us is allowed to be listened and allowed to speak, who is doing the listening? Who is doing the speaking? And if no one is really listening, are you expressing here a self? Or are you slowly losing one? Because expression without formation does not create authenticity, it creates a present absence.